following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I'm Ralph Tycho of the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and it's my privilege to introduce another episode of The Packaged Tourist, hosted by the Packaged Tourist in the magical mystery tour called Life, Matthew DiBiase, who tonight will be interviewing Noel Hynd on his iconic book, The Final Game at Ebbets Field, to commemorate the 60th anniversary when Ebbets Field was demolished in 1960.
Thank you, Ralph. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, our featured guest is author Noel Hynd. Noel has written countless books which have sold more than 7 million copies throughout the world. Although today he lives on the West Coast, Noel Hynd was born in 1947 in New York City and raised in New York State and Connecticut. He got a degree in international relations from the University of Pennsylvania and published his first book in 1975 when he was only 28 years old. His works of fiction run the gamut from supernatural thrillers to international action suspense spy novels to psychological horror and terror stories. And as a result, Noel Hynd has earned well-deserved acclaim from distinguished literary critics and societies alike for his magnificent body of work. Noel has also written articles for Sports Illustrated, Harper's, and other esteemed magazines, and has published books on baseball as well, with his latest work being The Final Game Played at Ebbets Field. Tonight we will discuss this ode to one of baseball's most venerable stadiums that sadly no longer exists, and we do so on the 60th anniversary of its demolition on February 23rd, 1960. Noel, how did your book, The Final Game Played at Ebbets Field, come about?
Well, interesting, because I'd always been more of a first off, thank you for having me, and thank you for such a generous lead-in. I barely recognized myself, but everything you did say was accurate. It's a funny thing. The Giants book led into the Dodgers book because I'd written what I like to think was the definitive account of the New York Giants in New York, the Giants of the Polo Grounds, which followed the team from 1883 till 1957. And I redid a new edition of that book about 2 years ago. And frankly, I didn't think I would be writing about baseball again, but I love to write about baseball, and I follow baseball, and I love baseball history. So as it happened, there were a lot of old New York Giants fans who were interested in the book, and they started to ask me questions about the Giants and the Dodgers, particularly with being on the podcast with Ralph Tycho and Alan Blumkin, talking about the Giants and the Dodgers in New York. And one day I got interested in the final game at Ebbets Field and what kind of happened, and I went to Google it, and there really wasn't much, and I didn't find much that had actually been published. So I started to dig around a little bit, talk to people who had gone to see the Dodgers play in 56 and 57, and I kind of reconstructed the game to start the book. The title, the book is actually a collection of baseball stories, all true, and the final game at Ebbets Field is kind of the centerpiece, and it's the opening. Let's just say it's like the first 4 innings of the book. But then I got into some other very interesting thing about the Dodgers in Brooklyn. And just the Dodger franchise. So the Dodger book came kind of out of the Giants book, to answer your question.
Let's talk about that final game at Ebbets Field. Who did they play? Who were the opponents?
The opponents were the Pittsburgh Pirates, who ironically were also the final visiting team at the Polo Grounds less than a week later. And they were also, if my aging memory is still good, they were the team that opened Ebbets Field in 1916, I guess it was. It was the Pittsburgh franchise.
Yeah, I think it was 1913, Noel, if I believe correctly.
That's
I think
right.
it commenced operations in 1913, if I recall correctly. You know, but
right.
I'm not challenging on the Pirates there. Most likely they did. But I remember, I think Ebbets Field opened in 13, if I recall my research right. Don't laugh, Noel.
You are correct.
When I was in high school, there was this book, I think it was written by a guy named Shannon. It was like a photo collection of all that showed diagrams and photographs of the old stadiums. And I was fascinated with it because it wasn't just Ebbets Field and Polo Grounds. You were looking at Crosley Field, Forbes Field, Connie Mack Stadium, and so on and so forth. So it was just, that's why I was so drawn by this book of yours, because I always loved those old vintage ballparks. Now, who won that game? Was it the Pirates or the Dodgers in that final game?
I'm blanking. The Dodgers won it. It was a 2-0 shutout. The young Danny McDevitt, who I believe was a rookie that year, pitched pretty much. I think he pitched a complete game. And the Pirates pitcher, it was his first major league start. A guy named Benny Daniels, who had a very respectable career as a major league pitcher. He later pitched in the World Series for the Pirates in 1960, and then went on and pitched with the Washington Senators, which couldn't have been the most pleasant thing to do in the 1960s, but nonetheless it was a major league job. He was a pretty good pitcher, often with mediocre teams. So yes, the Dodgers won it 2-0.
Was it difficult finding fans who were actually in attendance on that day? How did you reach out? Did you post an ad? I mean, did they seek you out? How were you able to talk to fans who were actually there on that sad day?
Frankly, I couldn't find any, and even if I had, I would have had to been a little bit suspect about it, because it's sort of like if you, for many years, if you reached out and tried to find people who've been at the Bobby Thompson home run game, you could find about 100,000 of them. And since there were only something like 17,000 at the game, it was a little bit suspect. So I went primarily on written records and also sports writers' records. And I talked to people like George Vesey, formerly of the New York Times, who and one of my former editors, a guy named Wally Exman, who sadly just passed away a couple of weeks ago, who had followed the Dodgers, and they were able to kind of recreate for me the atmosphere in New York at the time. There were only 6,702 people who were in the paid attendance. Of course, there were several dozen more people who were working at the ballpark selling coffee or whatever, and also on the teams. So fewer than 7,000 people easily in the ballpark that night.
When you were growing up as a boy, did you ever go to Ebbets Field to watch a game?
No, I did not. I watched not hundreds, but shall we say scores of them on Channel 9 in New York, because the Dodgers would broadcast locally very generously. And no, my father took me to the Polo Grounds twice, and we never got to Ebbets Field. And years later, he said, "Damn, we should have done that." But he was a little bit. We were living in Connecticut at the time, and my father had grown up in a very tough area of Trenton, New Jersey, and I think he was, to be honest with you, a little leery of going to Brooklyn, having sort of gotten away from the rough and tumble stuff. But he had gone several times. There's a anecdote in the book about my father taking a bunch of war heroes called the Flying Tigers, who were American airmen who were serving in China during World War II. And my father wrote for several of the magazines, prominent magazines in the 1940s. And there was a commander named Claire Chennault, that's how he pronounced his name, who was head of the American airmen attached to the Chinese Air Force fighting against Japan. And some of them came to New York to raise money for victory bonds. And as my father recalled the story, there was a big game coming up at Ebbets Field against the Cardinals. And at the time, this is the 1940s, Dodgers and the Cardinals were the two power teams in the National League. After the interviewing was over for my father's article, he said, "Well, you guys have another day in New York. What would you like to do?" They huddled together, and one of them turns and says, "Is there any chance we could go see the Brooklyn Dodgers?" And my father kind of laughed and said, "Well, that's going to be a tough one, but let me see what I can do." So he called the front office, and he was just persistent. And finally, they said, "Well, who are these important people you're trying to get into the ballpark?" And he said, "It's members of the Air Corps that are fighting in Asia right now. They're in New York for a couple of days." And magically, 8 tickets became available. So 6 of them went, my father went, and my mother went. And I believe they went in uniform and got a standing ovation coming down the aisle to sit behind the Dodger dugout.
Wow, that's beautiful.
Yeah, you can't make that stuff up. But it's when people say, "What is your greatest memory of Ebbets Field?" I have to borrow my dad's because he was there, and you really can't beat that one. You really can't.
No, based on your research, what people told you, can you paint for our listeners a picture of Ebbets Field? What was the ambiance and the vibes of that ballpark? If we went back into a time machine and actually went to a game there, can you paint a picture for us, for our listeners? What was it like sitting in the stands there?
Well, as my father once said, because he in the 40s used to go there a lot because he was a newspaper man, and he'd go over there, and it was mostly day games at the time. He lived in New York in the 30s and 40s. One of the things I always remember him saying is it's a wild crowd. It's a wonderful crowd, but it's a wild, primarily working-class crowd, a lot of immigrants. They love the team. Their vocabulary is not something you're going to want to use at home. And he said, if you leave your seat to get a hot dog, it might not be there when you come back. It was that type of place. It was not like Yankee Stadium, which was a very orderly place. But it was I don't want to say it was cramped, but I think cozy is the nice word. Duke Snider once said, the thing about playing at Ebbets Field was if you got the ball in the air, it had a good chance of going out, being a home run. And at the Polo Grounds, it was different because a lot of the Giants pitchers would try to get you to hit to center field. And, of course, we know who was out in center field for the Giants in the 1950s during Snyder's career. So anything in the air, it had to be placed pretty well without number 24 tracking it down. However, to go back to Ebbets, the seats were narrow. The aisles were very narrow. You have to realize it was built, as you said, 1913. So it was a very sort of cozy, a cozy place with crowded aisles, enthusiastic fans. You could smell sometimes the Bond, one of the bakeries, I forget which one, which would be making fresh bread. And there was another bakery, I think, nearby, a pretzel place. So it was filled with kind of great aromas and scents. You could always smell beer because there was always some guy with a cup of beer. People always used to talk about how you could, on a hot day, the place just smelled of sweat and cigar smoke, and voices were in your ear the whole time. Later on, and this was phrased sometimes as a complaint, but a lot of the African-American fans loved to go to Ebbets Field because the Dodgers obviously were the most integrated team in baseball, and they would bring food with them. And so it would frequently smell of chicken and chicken sandwiches and other really wonderful-sounding food during doubleheader days. So it was a place that really kind of I don't want to say assaulted your senses, but you could smell it, you could feel it, you could hear it, and of course you were very, very close to the action because the capacity was in, I think, the low 30,000s. I think maybe 32 was the official capacity 32,000, 34,000 at the end, plus all the kids who snuck in, of course.
You know, it's been 62 years since the Brooklyn Dodgers played their last game at Ebbets Field, and yet even today, the mythology, the folklore, what is, based, living it and all that, what is your sense? Why is it that even today, you and I are having this talk about Ebbets Field, that it had, it ceased to be, 60 years ago, and people still talk about it with their websites dedicated to its history, just as there's websites dedicated to the history of the Polo Grounds. What do you think? Why is it that Ebbets Field still is etched in America's baseball consciousness? What is your personal theory about it?
I think there's a lot of things going on. First of all, a lot of people are fascinated with the overall era of when there were only, I think, 8, I forget how many cities. Well, but 8 teams in each league. Maybe 11 cities overall, something like that. 3 teams in New York. It was a place where some great baseball was played, even though the Dodgers won fewer world championships than they probably should have. But it was an era of what we remember, the tail end of it, the 1950s. There are still people old enough to remember how basically the Dodgers were part of American sociology, the first team to integrate, the first team to defy the unwritten rule of only 2 African-American players on a team. I mean, there was a time when in the National League there were 0 African-American players on some teams, 1 or 2 on another's, and the Dodgers would scoff laws because they would have 3 and they would be in first place. So, it was the era of Mantle, Berra, Howard, Snyder, Mays. And you have to give a lot of credit to the wonderful book by the great Roger Kahn, who unfortunately just passed away. I think that book brought Ebbets Field back into consciousness for a couple of generations. You can go to that book tomorrow, reread it, and it will take you right back there. And again, it was part of the sociology. You also had, if I can keep rambling on this, you had at Ebbets Field, I think I came across in a couple of books about the fan base, there were the fan base of the Dodgers was heavily Jewish, and a lot of those people obviously became those kids who hung out there became professional people, very well-educated people. They went into journalism and they wrote about their experiences, which is wonderful because they recorded the history, perhaps with their own pro-Dodger slant. But you had a lot of Dodger fans in the media. I put stuff in that about in the final game at Ebbets Field. I would come across quotes from Marv Albert, for example, saying, when I was a kid, I was a Dodger fan. Kareem Jabbar, when he was a kid in New York, he was a Dodger fan. So, this whole Larry King was a Dodger fan. And Larry King made a point of bringing his own kids back and showing them the place. And, of course, Doris Kearns Goodwin did also. So there've been a lot of great books. It's why I wrote a book about the Giants. I thought, hey, how come all these other people writing these great books about the Brooklyn Dodgers doesn't anybody remember the Giants? So to some degree, they inspired me to compete with them. So it was just something that has captured people aware of baseball history and New York history and sports history. And, of course, New Yorkers, let's face it, I can say this because I'm one myself, New Yorkers are very proud of the city and always want to tell you about the city, don't want to shut up about the city. So, again, a lot of things going on. And everything I said, I mean very, very affectionately with no disrespect intended whatsoever. Go ahead.
Were you able to interview any of the Dodgers players who took part in that game? Anybody at all you were able to talk to about that game?
Only I had a nice conversation. Well, there aren't very many of them around, unfortunately. Newcomb was ailing at the time. I couldn't get in touch with him. Lasorda, who was part of the organization, I actually sent Tom Lasorda a copy of the Giants book, of all things, which he got a kick out of, because a woman named Ann Keene, who wrote a wonderful book called The Cloudbuster Nine, about her father's experience as a bat boy for an Army team that featured Ted Williams in the 1940s. Was going to interview Tom Lasorda the next day after I saw Ann at a Sabre event. So, no, I couldn't find anybody available who was in the game, but I did talk to Carl Erskine, who remains very generous with his time, about the game, and just confirmed some of the things like the atmosphere and everything. He's well into his 90s, so I did not want to take a lot of his time. But he was very nice enough to have a conversation with me and talk about what it was like to pitch there, which I included in the book.
He was a great curveball pitcher, and he set a World Series record for most strikeouts in a game in the '53 World Series. I remember his name well. Oysk, right?
Oh, yeah.
That was his name, Oysk?
Oysk, yeah. Hey, you're Oysk, aren't you? Yeah, in fact, Oysk is the I did a little math and research, and Carl Erskine was the 5th most winning pitcher, I believe, in Brooklyn Dodger history.
Wow. No,
yeah.
Whenever I interview an author, I always ask the standard question because it's always interesting to see, the responses I get. When you were growing up, before you entered into a writing career, who were your favorite authors or writers who inspired you and perhaps influenced your own writing style and helped inspire you to become a writer in your own right? Who were your influences? Who were your inspirations?
Well, going back to the beginning of your question, it presupposes that I've grown up, and I'm not sure that I even admit to that these days. But as I remember sitting down writing, first of all, I always read my father's stories. My father wrote true crime, so there's always stuff in the house. Let's say when I got to my teens, I read a lot of Ian Fleming. I think I read through everything he had published by the early 60s, and they were just, his books would fascinate me. I always liked Irwin Shaw, who was a Brooklyn guy, when I was in the teen years, and also Graham Greene. What I liked particularly about Shaw and Greene is that they could write interesting stuff, but it was also commercial stuff. So you could be a classy guy and still be able to pay the rent and support yourself. So those are the names I normally give. And I read a lot of books about baseball, almost anything I could find. In fact, one of my English teachers, I would then write about baseball for English class. And one of my teachers actually forbid me from writing about baseball anymore. So it didn't work out for him that well because I'm still writing about it today.
Do you anticipate writing another baseball book in the future, Noel?
Yeah, I'd like to write a baseball novel, and I think this one is going to be centered on the Yankees in the 1950s. I like writing about other eras because I just already know a lot about them. So I've already done a lifetime of research on particularly the 40s, the 20s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. So I'd like to do a baseball novel maybe within the next 2 years, touching on the Yankees. And then I will have fulfilled my moral obligation of writing a book focused on the 3 New York teams that were there when I was growing up.
Oh, I know. It was a golden age from 47 to 57, to 58. A New York team was always in the World Series. I mean, that must have been an incredible time to be living in the city there when you think about it. You knew one of those 3 teams. It's going to be in the Fall Classic. It must have been something.
Yeah, absolutely. I can remember in 1959, I guess it was, For the first time, it was Los Angeles Dodgers against the Chicago White Sox. And there was a lot of muttering in New York that the Yankees had kind of screwed up by not winning. They cost the city a lot of money by not being in the World Series. True, by the way.
A little deviation from baseball. I noticed doing some research on your background. You went to the University of Pennsylvania. Is that correct?
Yes, I did. I was there when our current president was there.
Oh my goodness! And you got was it your degree? Was it quote, international relations? Is that correct? Was that your degree?
Yeah, I guess it was.
And I'm kind of curious now. A good bit of your books deal with foreign espionage and all of that. I'm kind of curious. Did you ever think about getting into intelligence work? I mean, that type of degree. I mean, were you ever approached by the CIA, or did you ever? I mean, I once tried for the CIA once, and 30 years ago I tried to apply, but they rejected me. I was kind of curious. Did you ever have a thought of doing like intelligence work, anything like that, or no?
It never. I could spin you a great story or two, but it would be completely made up. And I do make my living out of fiction usually, so it would be a pretty good story. But the answer to that is no. And to be very candid with you, I was at Penn in the late 1960s and was in sort of one of the lighter wings of the anti-war movement. So I had a feeling that if I ever applied for anything like that, they would not. I would not be accepted anyway. So that kind of precluded that.
The settings of your novels, are they modern day or is that more retro style? In other words, you go backwards in time. I mean, and do you have you talked about Ian Fleming. Of course, you had James Bond. Do you have in your novels like a set character who keeps coming back over and over again, a person, male or female, any in that style?
Well, yes, sort of. The most successful of the novels that I've written was one titled Flowers from Berlin. It was originally published by Doubleday in 1986, and then I got my rights back in around the year 2000, and I set up a small publishing operation in Los Angeles, and I started to republish myself, some of my father's work, and a few other people, mostly people I knew. And that book just kept selling and selling and selling and selling, and still is in the top 100 on Amazon Kindle. So I put my email address in every book because I like to hear from readers, and I kept getting emails saying, that's a wonderful character and a wonderful story. I'm sorry to leave him. Did you ever think of doing anything with him again? So finally, it dawned on me, yeah, sure, let's bring him back. And that's what Return to Berlin is about. It's the same guy who has to go back. Flowers from Berlin takes place right before the Second World War. Return to Berlin takes place with the same American agent going back in 1943 on a special assignment. And of course, it is risky as living hell, because if you are arrested as a spy in Nazi Germany, you are most likely going to be guillotined. So it was kind of hair-raising stuff. And because I believe that number 3 is a lucky number, this is going to become a trilogy. So I'm going to have a third Berlin story, hopefully by the end of this year. Similarly, I've had a book called Truman Spy, which is also a spy story, obviously, back in also in the late 80s. And a new edition of that came out a few years ago. That's selling nicely, too. So, naturally, Eisenhower Spy is coming up toward the early summer of this year, and I will probably turn that one into a 3-part series also. So that's the long answer. The short answer to your question is yes, there are a couple of recurring characters.
Getting back to the Dodgers, How much did the departure of the Brooklyn Dodgers exacerbate the decline of the borough of Brooklyn? Because I know by the early to mid-'60s, parts of Brooklyn were like literally urban cauldrons, like Bedford-Stuyvesant, and it drew like, you know, national attention. You know, Robert F. Kennedy and other leaders, you know, trying to rebuild, you know, and rehabilitate Brooklyn. How much did the loss of the Dodgers contribute to that decline and fall of the borough, in your view?
Considerably. It was perhaps, to use sort of a Yogi Berra-ism on it, it was probably about 50% economic and 90% mental, because the idea, you know, there was an idea, a pervasive feeling that people were just moving out of the city. To be very blunt, it was it was a racial attitude. People, if African Americans were moving in, you had to move out. You had to move out to farther in Long Island or New Jersey or something. So it was a psychological thing that just kept perpetuating itself. So I think it did a lot of damage to the borough. I think it did huge damage to the borough, and to some degree the damage lasts until this day. The idea of a new ballpark over there is something that's still being contested as to whether that could have been possible or not. Certainly within the attitudes of the late 1950s, it wasn't going to happen. And it's not just New York that was guilty of stuff like that, too. St. Louis let the neighborhood around Busch Stadium go. Philadelphia was horrible about the area around Connie Mack Stadium. So it was the mentality of people who ran the cities, a lot of democratic machines, which basically were responsive to white Catholic working class people, and nobody else. It was what it was. So I think the departure of the Dodgers exacerbated the problem and accelerated the problem.
Tell me, I'm going to tell you just a tiny little story, and tell me if you ever had people approach you and tell you like similar type stories. The only time I ever went to Brooklyn, I visited the Brooklyn Museum. Then after I finished there, I knew I was very close to the site of where Ebbets Field used to be and all that, and I wanted to walk the perimeter block where the stadium used to be. And when I was on Bedford Avenue, there at that apartment complex where, you know, it used to be, I kept looking up over my right shoulder, and I kept expecting to see a Duke Snider home run ball come bouncing at my feet. Have you ever had old Dodgers fans come up to you and express that same type of sentiment? In other words, where's the home run ball? Where is it? You know, where is it? Have you ever gotten people getting that same sensation or feeling?
No. Well, you could probably get some psychiatric help on that if you need it.
I mean, I never lived in New York, but I remember as a kid in the 1970s, Kurt Gowdy used to host a sports show called The Way It Was, and they would talk to the old players, you know, like DiMaggio, Snyder, Gianfrido, and Glavicetto about like the 47 World Series, the 52 World Series, or the 55 or 56 World Series, and they would show clips of Duke Snider hitting one right over the right field wall into Bedford Avenue and seeing the kids scramble for the home run ball and all that. So that's why I always had that little feeling, you know, because it was just trying to imagine, you know, being a kid, you know, right there outside the wall there, hoping for Duke Snider to hit one, you know, over the screen, you know, into Bedford Avenue and all that. I just kind of wondered if you ever had, you know, Dodger fans come up to you and tell you like similar stories or something like that. I was just curious.
No, but the only experiences similar to that I might have had was when I was at Penn. A couple of friends of mine and I would go to Phillies games at Connie Mack Stadium, and the Phillies management at the time was very active in letting the ballpark fall apart because they knew they were going to get a new stadium down in South Philadelphia. So not much had been done to that stadium. So you could look, and often it was empty. So often you could look around and think, wow, this is the place where, they played the 1931 World Series. And this is where so-and-so. The other feeling that I did have similar to that was when I worked for Sports Illustrated and a couple of other magazines, I did a couple of interviews at Yankee Stadium. I interviewed Kevin Moss, who was a star for the Yankees for about a year and a half, around 1989, I guess. And so I got a press pass and got to go into the locker room of what was then the old Yankee Stadium. And it was really kind of, you'd sit there, and of course there was Munson's locker, which was empty. But even above and beyond that, not that much had changed in those corridors from the time that the stadium had been built. So, you're standing in the same corridor that Ruth and Gehrig and DiMaggio and Mantle went through. Yeah. And so if there was nothing else in your line of view, you could kind of start dreaming a little bit and start imagining, wow, these are the same steps that, those guys went up and down the same corridor. Very narrow. It had been repainted, of course, at the time, but it was a very, very interesting feeling.
I know in 1997, last week in May in 1997, I actually had tickets to Fenway Park. It was a Red Sox-Yankees game. I had tickets in dead center field, and I will tell you, one of my favorite ballparks is Fenway. And sitting in those stands, I was just tingling all over. I mean, it was, for me, one of the most transcendental moments of my life that here I am in Fenway Park. And, 80 at the time, it was 85 years old. And just, knowing, Williams, Yaz, Ruth, Smokey Joe Wood, Bobby Doerr, Fred Lynn, all those guys, had played there. And I mean, to me, I was tingling all over. I mean, it was one of the most magical evenings of my life. So I think the only other way I would feel the same way is if I ever watched a game at Wrigley Field. Have you ever been to Wrigley Field?
I have never been to Wrigley, no.
Yeah, but I would love to do Wrigley Field.
It's on my list.
Yeah, me too. I would give anything to do it. I wish I could have gone to Tiger Stadium, but it's too late now. It's just they closed it down a long time ago and all that. I would love to have tried Tiger Stadium. That would have been something, No,
I'll tell you.
I want to
if I can just sneak in a final thing. When my father, earlier in his career, was a newspaperman in Boston, and he used to go to, he worked for the Boston Post, which was an afternoon paper, and so they would frequently wrap up at about 2 p.m., and then the reporters would all go out to either Braves Field or Fenway. I got to visit Boston with my family in, I think it was about 1957, 58, and we got out of a cab. My father hired a cab to take us around Boston, and we were at Fenway when the field was being spruced up for the start of the new season, which was coming up, and there was a gate open. So my father signaled to the family and said, let's get out. Let's try something here. So one way or another, he goes over to whoever the guard is. He probably slipped the guy $5 or something. And he said, I used to work for the Boston Post. Can I show my family this wonderful field you have here? And they said, sure. So I got to go into Fenway, and I even got to walk. I got a conversation with the grounds guy in left field who was hosing down the spot where Williams played, and I got to go behind the scoreboard, which was basically like going through somebody's cellar. It was all, numbers scattered all over, concrete, broken benches and things. And then I got to walk all along the outfield from foul pole to foul pole. And then I looked up and, they're beckoning me back. So I didn't cut across the field. I went around the running track. So that was my first sight and greatest memory of Fenway.
Oh, man, you lucky devil, you. Oh, because I'll tell you as a kid, even though I grew up in the greater Philadelphia area and I was technically a Phillies fan, you know what my fantasy was when I was a kid? Hitting a 3-run home run over the Green Monster in Fenway and winning the World Series for the Boston Red Sox and doing the Ted Williams home run trot around the bases. That was my baseball fantasy as a kid. Did you ever have a baseball? I mean, did you ever dream of hitting one in the Polo Grounds or anything like that? Did you have a fantasy like that?
I hate to admit it, but I still do.
Okay. Do you mind sharing that little fantasy, if you don't mind?
Oh, well, I can still see those foul lines, because I went to a lot of Mets games in '62 and '63, and
wow.
It looks like you could throw the ball. You can't really. Well, I couldn't, but those foul lines, sometimes when you're in a ballpark, just with your eye kind of figure out where the 257 mark would be down the left field line, or where the 279 would be down the right field line. And you get an idea of just how short that was. And, of course, then there was an overhang in left field where Bobby Thompson hit his home run. His went into the lower deck, but the upper deck hung over that. So, I can still sort of see that, and what it must have been like. And if I can amend that with a final story, when I was writing the book on the New York Giants, one of the things I added to the new edition, which was published, this is The Giants at the Polo Grounds, which was published 2 years ago, I went back and I actually found people who had been to the ballpark to see the Giants, and apparently the baseball coach at the prep school I went to had a tryout with the Giants, and he never told anyone about it. And the tryout did not go that well for reasons which I won't divulge now, but they're complicated, but they're in the book. But when I talked to him about it, he said, it was really no big deal. And I said, you stood on the mound that Christy Mathewson and Carl Hubble and, all of those people pitched from? And he said, well, it was different dirt by then, but it was the same mound. I thought, oh, wow. I mean, that is a piece of baseball Americana right there.
Just a little sidebar. I wish someone would make a movie on the life of Mel Ott, because you could make a good little baseball biopic on his life story. I mean, for the time, the youngest person ever to play Major League Ball, young kid out of Louisiana, teams up with John McGraw. John McGraw's last great gift at baseball. You could make a tight little movie on the Mel Ott story. It's a pity no one's ever tried it, in my view. What do you think?
I'd go. Let's put it that way. Unfortunately, with moviegoers, I doubt that very many people know who Mel Ott was anymore. But it's the type of thing maybe you'd have a shot at with cable television. He apparently had a romance with Tallulah Bankhead, which could be a spicy part of that show. Wow! But we're getting away from the baseball field a little bit on that.
But I had the pleasure of reading your Polo Grounds book, and it's a fantastic read, Noel, and I deeply appreciate it because, like I said, I have this motto: history abhors a vacuum, and basically your book more than fills a vacuum about a definitive oral history of the New York baseball Giants, in my view. And as a baseball fan of great baseball literature, I thank you for it, okay?
Thank you very much. It's like 225,000 words, which proves once for all that on a subject that I really love, I just cannot shut up, because I put, as you know, everything I possibly could into that book, and I probably could have kept going. I to this day, I still think of things that, I could have had a section on this, but it was just, if there'd been any more pages, it would have been volume 1 and volume 2.
No, I want to thank you. You talk about being honored to be on my show. Actually, I'm honored that you came on my show, because as of now, you are the most distinguished writer to yet appear on my show, because I've only started since last October, and by far you are the most highly esteemed author to appear on my show yet. So I am deeply honored that you for your time and your generosity, Mr. Hynd, and I wish you all the best.
I appreciate all of that, but keep in mind records are set to be broken, so I'm sure you'll get some other really good people sometime soon. But thank you. It's been a fun discussion. I appreciate it.
Thank you. God bless you, and you take care, Mr. Hynd.
Thanks very much. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye. Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, show where I will be interviewing Canadian author David Dupuis on the first 2 volumes of his fictional heptology, The 7 Keys to Hildegard. Thank you and good night.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.